Bush and Me by Joyce Heron Larkin. Written in the 1930s, typed in 1997 and self-published in that year. Preface. Early in life, I thought I will be this and I will be that. Oh, what a shock it was when life flattened me on the mat. In later years, I thought I did not do well at this or that. Then a voice from the past whispered in my ear. Don't give up yet. Then at 70, I picked myself up from the mat and reached back through the years. I found these tales of my childhood and am able to laugh at myself through the years. So that is that. 1. The Goat. Mum held the large bar of homemade soap over the warming water in the copper and shaved the flaky pieces off with a knife, swishing the soap around with a copper stick until the flakes had melted and the water was hot and bubbling. The sheets, towels and pillowcases would boil madly as Mum put more wood on the fire under the copper. As the flames turned to glowing coals, the boiling water would send steam to the ceiling of the old laundry. I would watch as Mum lifted the clothes with the old copper stick into one of the cement tubs to allow the soapy water to drain away. Then filling the tub with clean water to rinse the washing, before placing them in the next tub, which had been filled with water that had been coloured to a beautiful blue, with a blue bag tied in a piece of clean cloth. As the clothes were wrung out and placed in the washing basket, they turned into an icy white. When all this had been done, the washing was hung on the clothesline, which was a long piece of wire tied between two poles with a forked pole in the middle, which Mum would hoist to the skies. Now the washing dried in the gentle breeze scented by the surrounding gum trees. We lived in a small cottage on a sheep and cattle property where my father worked as a boundary rider. He would be away all day riding around the fences to see there were no breaks which the animals could wander through. We will go for a walk later, Mum said. The people living nearest to us were some miles away, so I did not have any playmates, and always wandering outside was the goat, so going for a walk was quite exciting. Would Mum ever be ready to go? Then at long last, we can go now. As we walked towards the hills behind the house, I could hardly contain myself, running ahead, then coming back when I was called. Be careful, there could be snakes, said Mum. The day felt good, with the sounds of the birds, the heat, and the smell of the grass and gum trees. We would sit on a large rock to rest now and again, until I grew restless. We had gone into the bush a fair way by this time. We should start back, Mum said. The shadows were growing long, and a slight breeze had sprung up, stirring the trees. As we turned and started to walk back, things looked different. The bush seemed thicker. Mum looked worried, and the bush did not seem friendly anymore. The sun was going down, and we were lost. What's going to happen to us, Mum? I said, trying not to cry. Keep quiet, I think I hear something, Mum said. There was a rustling in the bushes near us. By now we were both frightened. We would have run, but seemed to have lost the use of our legs. So we just stood there, shivering. Suddenly it appeared out of the bush, yellow eyes gleaming, our old goat. We had never been so happy to see her. She had followed at a safe distance from the time we left the house. Now she had had enough and wanted to go home. As she walked past us, Mum said, "Follow her." And sure enough, in no time we were out of the bush and could see the house in the distance. As we came nearer, we could see Dad in the doorway. "I was coming to look for you," he said. I don't think Mum ever told him we had been lost. I think it stayed our secret. Mum, mine, and the goat's. Dolph's Christmas. There were 2 horses, 3 dogs, and lots of chooks all roaming around together. Dad was at home. It was a few days before Christmas, and Mum was planning the dinner for the day. Suddenly a shadow fell across the doorway, and there he stood. He always seemed to appear out of nowhere, this large dark man with the black beard. This was Dolph, Dad's fishing mate. My father knew the most interesting people. We lived about 3 miles out of town at this time, having moved from the property. Dad now worked at a dairy. Once a fortnight, Dad would drive into town with the horse and sulky to do the shopping. He would take me and Dolph would come too. When we arrived in town, I would sit in the sulky under the trees while the two of them did the shopping. They would appear about an hour later with the shopping in large brown paper bags. Having, I think, stopped off somewhere else to quench their thirst, which had put a smile on their faces and a brightness to their eyes. These were happy days for me as I was allowed to drive the horse and sulky home. On the way, there would be brought forth a bag of hot meat pies, which we would eat on the way home. They were such a treat. Mum was a good cook, but this was something different. The day before Christmas, Dolph appeared at the door. "Would you all like to come to my place for Christmas dinner?" he said. I don't think Mum wanted to jump at the chance of having dinner at Dolph's corrugated iron house in the middle of summer, but was touched by his kindness. "Thank you," Mum said. "We will be there." The walls of Dolph's house was the same as the outside, except he had hung some colourful pictures cut from magazines, which lent a startling gaiety to the walls. The dirt floors had been swept clean and sprinkled with water to keep the dust down. As we ate our way through the boiled mutton, potatoes and cabbage, he was complimented on the fine dinner. "The best is yet to come," he said, and with a flourish removed the lid from a large saucepan which had been standing on the wood stove. "I've got a pudding," he said, and to our amazement put a large furry thing on the table before us. "Could not find anything to cook it in, so did it in the saddle blanket. Will be all right on the inside," he said. And it was. 3. Donk and the Chinese Boy. Walking home from school, kicking at the hot, dry dust. How I hated that place, I thought. Getting picked on by the big kids. The only good thing about it was my friend, the little Chinese boy. He was very quiet, and we would sit together at playtime and keep out of the way of the others. This day, as I walked past the orchard up to the house, I glanced in, looking for Dad's 2 horses. The ginger sulky horse was there, but the grey trotter had gone. Walking on up the path, still with the orchard in view, there standing beneath one of the trees was a little dapple grey pony with a white mane and tail. I ran to the house. "Who owns the pony?" I shouted. "He is yours," Dad said. Standing still, making sure I had heard right, my father and I looked at each other. In that moment was all the thanks I felt. We did not go on with a lot of talk, Dad and me. The pony did not seem to care that I was skinny with long legs and a bit untidy. It was love at first sight. Walking up to the pony, I touched its velvet nose. He looked at me, then took off around the orchard. Up went the hind legs and the tail flying. As he came trotting to me, he seemed to say, "How was that?" After a few days getting to know each other, the pony and I were great friends. "Can I ride him to school?" "Yes, but be careful," Dad said. "What will you call him?" "His name is Donk. A good plain name, nothing sissy." All the kids admired the pony, but the only one I would let near him was the Chinese boy. He would wait for me at the school gate and help me unsaddle the pony. We would both admire him until it was time to go into the classroom. One day, my friend turned up at school with a big slice of watermelon. I could not take my eyes off it. "If you lend me Donk, I will bring you a whole one tomorrow." I did not like this idea much, but could not get that melon out of my mind. "All right, but only this once." Next day, he turned up with the big watermelon, and after school, off he went with Donk. We'll never know how I got that melon home. But taking a shortcut across the paddock, having a spell now and again, was able to manage it. As I struggled to the door, Dad said, "Where have you been?" So I told him about the loan. "What?" roared Dad, his face going red. "Now it's not that bad," said Mum. Next thing off he went, and we heard him saddling the horse and galloping up the road. "Will he hit me, Mum?" "No, I don't think so. But you should not have done that. Hope you learn a lesson from this." The boy could fall off the pony and get hurt. With that watermelon in my sights, I had not thought of that. Dad returned home a couple of hours later, loaded down with fruit and vegetables. "Nice people," he said. "Donk will be back at school in the morning. You have to stick to a bargain." And they were both waiting for me, Donk and the Chinese boy. 4. Mr. Apple. Down the main road he came with his black coat tails flying, pedalling his push bike, big bag and umbrella strapped on the back, the school teacher. "There goes Mr. Apple. Time for school," Mum said. He had ridden out from the town and was passing the house where we lived, towards the little schoolhouse. "Hurry on. You can drive the cows to the paddock on your way to school," Dad would say, coming in from the milking. The cows would be driven a little way along the main road, then through a gate where they would feed and wander around under the trees until the afternoon milking. How I envied them. I would have to ride on to school where I would be inside most of the time. Arriving at the school, the horse would be unsaddled and wander under the trees with the horses that belonged to the children that rode to school. There were 6 boys and 4 girls in the schoolroom. One of the big boys, Alec Royce, was the one I disliked the most. As it was Friday, there would be sewing for the girls in the afternoon and drawing for the boys. Mrs. Apple, the teacher's wife, would drive out from town on her horse and sulky, and sit with the girls outside in the shade of the trees, and Mr. Apple would have drawing lessons for the boys in the classroom. I don't know if it was because I was always losing my sewing, or that Mr. Apple thought I showed promise in drawing, that I was put in the drawing class with the boys. Mr. Apple would wander outside and check with his wife and admire the girls' sewing. I still remember those afternoons with horror. The drawing was easy enough, but while he was outside, the boys would be making faces at me and calling me names. Alec Royce would come over and look at my drawing. "Draw me something on my paper," he would say. "No, you do your own drawing," I would say, shivering in my shoes, but knowing help was not far away. Mr. Apple did not stay out of the classroom for long. "I'll get you, this arvo," Alec Royce said as we heard the teacher's footsteps returning. Later in the afternoon, riding home from school, it felt good. The thought of the weekend ahead, away from school, was too wonderful to think about. My thoughts were of the scones and jam that Mum would have ready, and maybe I would be allowed to help with the milking, and the new pups to play with once it got too dark to be outside, and the meal was over. I would watch Mum making sausages and setting the bread to rise to be cooked the next day, while Dad read by the lamp at the kitchen table. Suddenly, I was shaken from my dreaming as my horse started bolting down the road. Alex Royce had ridden up behind me and hit my horse across the back with a stick. It was only that I was used to riding and did not fall off, but I could not pull the horse up until it was through the gate and stopped in front of Dad, who had seen me flying down the road. "What happened?" he said. So I told him. His face went very red and he looked angry. Then he was on the horse and riding up the road to the Royces. Why did I tell him? It would be worse than ever at school now, I thought. When Dad returned, he looked a little better. Monday morning had to come. As I rode to school, I thought how I hated it all and wish I was grown up and out of all of this. There he was, waiting at the school gate as I got off my horse. He walked towards me. "Let me unsaddle your horse for you." And it was like that until Alex Royce left the little school and we went our own separate ways. 5. The Sunday School Play. There was much excitement at the Sunday School. Christmas was about 2 weeks away, and there was to be a play. The Sunday School was held on the veranda of the big house owned by our nearest neighbours about a mile away. Sunday was a day of dressing in my best dress and trying not to dirty it. This was hard because living on a dairy, it was just like any other day. The cows had to be milked and the animals fed. I would take the scraps to the dogs and the pups after everyone had eaten. "Keep your dress clean and hurry back," Mum would say. The horse would be saddled and off I would go. The best thing I thought about Sunday school was getting the cards with the flowers on them and some written words, but I was only interested in the painted flowers. This was the day we were to be given our parts for the play. Though it was to be at Christmas, it was to have an Australian setting with the hero and heroine and some children dressed as animals to take part. Oh, how I would love to be the heroine and wear a frilly dress and have my hair curled. We were all gathered on the veranda, and now the boring part would begin. The lady of the house, who was the Sunday school teacher, would talk to us about being kind and love people. This would become too much for me. Her voice would become a drone and I would escape into one of my dreams. Wonder what would be for dinner. Mum would be at the big wood stove taking out the baking dish, the roast meat sizzling and brown. This would be taken out and placed on a plate to rest before carving. Then in would go the vegetables to be baked, potatoes and pumpkin. When these were cooked to a crisp brown, they would be put back into the oven to keep warm, and the thick brown gravy would be made. After this, the dripping was poured into the tin, which was always kept for this purpose. It was very tasty spread on bread with salt and pepper. The peas from the garden would be shelled and ready to cook with some fresh mint that grew near the water tank. Suddenly there was a stir, and I was back at Sunday school. Now for the great moment, the cast will be chosen. All these Sundays would be worthwhile. I would be a star at last. We listened more attentively than we had for weeks. The teacher announced Mary will play the heroine, Alec and Dan will play the horse, and Joyce will play the kangaroo. Oh well, a kangaroo was better than nothing, and there would be sweets and cakes after the show. Six, the cure. The mozzies were bad last night. They nearly ate us, said Mum. We will fix that, Dad replied. I have an hour to spare after breakfast. We will go for a walk. There was some work to do before we set off. There were chooks to feed and eggs to gather. The grass was very long in the orchard, and the hens would roam around and make their nests. Sometimes there would be a hen sitting on eggs waiting for her chicks to arrive. I would have to take food and water for her every day, as she would not leave her nest. Then one day she arrived at the kitchen door with the chicks, some black, some yellow, and all peeping and falling over each other. Dad made a shelter for her away from the other chooks until the babies could fend for themselves. Let's go, Dad said, with a chaff bag slung over his shoulder, and Mum and I following with 2 dogs barking with excitement as we crossed the yard and into the paddock we went. Could we go to the river? I said. The dogs would like a swim. We tripped down to the edge of the river under the willow tree. Then we waited as the dogs looked at the water. Suddenly there was a movement on the opposite bank as a shy lizard came out from under a log. The dogs were into the water with a splash, swimming to the opposite side. Of course, by the time the dogs arrived, the lizard had disappeared. Come along, said Dad. The dogs will come when they are ready. And sure enough, in a short time, they were shaking water all over us. What are we looking for? Said Mum. We need some cow manure. Look for some good dry ones. About 3 will do. We did not ask Dad a lot of questions. I was sure he knew everything. After the cow manure had been collected and was safely in the bag, Dad said, I will go back now. You can take your time. Mum and I walked back slowly, enjoying the outing. There are some mushrooms, Mum said. They were showing white above the ground. They had sprung up after the night rain and the morning sun had brought them out. Do not pick any toadstools, Mum would say. Some of these looked like mushrooms but had longer stalks and a creamy shade underneath. They could make people very ill, so we were taught very early not to touch them. Mum and I picked as many mushrooms as we could carry and headed for home. Before cooking the evening meal, Mum had a rest in the afternoon, and I rode across the paddock to drive the milking cows home. The big kitchen, where Mum did her cooking and we ate our meals, was at the end of the hall. The main rooms of the house were closed off, so the kitchen could be kept nice and warm on the cool evenings. All of a sudden, we heard a scuffling and banging in the hall. As Dad opened the door, a terrified possum charged through the door, followed by a thick cloud of smoke. Dad had lit the manure, so there would be no mozzies that night. 7. The country picnic. Bang! There goes another bottle of Mum's homemade ginger beer. This was kept in the spare room and was so strong that sometimes one of the corks, which was tied with string, would work loose and off it would go. Sometimes it would happen in the middle of the night. Then the dogs would start barking and Dad would be going mad. But it was all worthwhile because the ginger beer was for that great day. The country picnic. Everyone would be there. The picnic would be held in the big paddock across the road from the dairy under the big gum trees where the grass was soft and green. The day was clear, hot and sunny. Everyone was up early. There was a lot to do, the milking had to be done and the cows turned out to graze. Mum had started by slicing the corn mutton and making the homemade brawn for the sandwiches, which was to go into the freshly made bread. Everything was made in those days. There were no shops nearby. Everything from the butter to the pickles, chutneys and jams were cooked at home. In the pantry, there were sponge cakes filled with cream and tarts filled with blackberry jam. The blackberries were gathered from the bushes that grew along the banks of the river. The children would take pails and off we would go across the paddocks, sometimes exploring the odd rabbit hole to see if there were any baby ones. We would only look at them. Nothing was ever hurt. We would have a paddle in the shallow part of the river. We were told never to go near the deeper parts as we could fall in, and there could be tree branches in the dark green water, and we would get caught. Near the blackberry bushes, we would stamp about and make a lot of noise in case there were snakes in the long grass. The blackberries were dark purple and wonderful to eat. We would fill our buckets and turn purple as the juice stained our hands and faces. Then we would wander home, very pleased with ourselves. On the day of the picnic, there would be more excitement. In the middle of the preparations, the owner of the dairy would arrive from town to bring his daughter. I was fascinated as she always kept herself so clean and tidy. She would sit talking to my mother, while I was always out running around not being able to keep still with all the excitement. Dolph, Dad's friend, would be there with his gift for the picnic. All the children from the little school would be there too. Mrs. Bloom would bring homemade bread and jars of honey. Her 2 daughters would be with her. They all smelled of honey. Even their house had the same aroma. I loved to visit them and see the honeycomb being taken from the hives, all golden and sweet. My friend, the Chinese boy, would be there with his mother and father, with baskets of vegetables and fruit. Mr. Apple, the teacher, would drive out from town with his wife, looking much the same as they did at school. She with a tine of honey biscuits, and he with his watch ready to start the races. As the day wore on, everyone was talking and laughing. Mum was made to sit on a blanket, and we waited on her for once. I was trying to keep clean but was losing the battle. Already there was jam on the front of my dress. Mum just smiled and let me go. Dolph pulled a boiled chook out of a paper bag and placed it on the table, which had been erected from wooden planks. It was now groaning from the weight of food and drinks. The Sunday school teacher brought a fruit cake with thick white icing. Then there were Mum's sponge cakes, jam tarts and homemade ginger beer, Mrs. Bloom's bread and jars of honeycomb. There were also lamingtons and all sorts of cool drinks. The races had been won with prizes for the winners. I won the hop, skip and jump and received a pink lolly pig. There was a dog fight and 2 men had to lift Mrs. Bloom up because she was very big and had sat for too long. What a wonderful day! the change. Dad had decided we needed a change and obtained work as a wool classer at a shearing shed. The owners were also looking for a cook, and my mother thought it would be a good idea that she should try the job, having had some experience through the years. Dad had saved some money, and by selling Donk and the grey horse, he was able to buy a car. There were lots of tears, as I was to miss Donk for a lot of years. But things had to be done for the best in those days. So off we set for the new adventure. As Dad drove along the country roads, things were always happening. Often we would see rabbits sitting on the side of the road, and the kangaroos would hop off into the bush. Then there were the swaggies carrying their belongings rolled into a blanket on their backs and their billy cans swinging. Dad would always give some a lift. It would be a 2-day journey to the new place of work, so we had to camp overnight on the way. Late in the afternoon, Dad pulled to the side of the road to put the tent up for the night and have a meal. I would never forget the smell as the fire was lit with dry twigs and gum leaves which had been gathered from under the trees. When the fire had burned down, out came Mum's big frying pan. Then on went the bacon, followed by the eggs, and then some slices of bread, cut for toasting by the coals of the fire. Sometimes there would be men of the road, and they would join us. Now and again a mouth organ would appear, and there would be music. Other times there would be a good storyteller, and he would regale us with ghost stories. There is nothing like these tales as the fire goes down and the night draws in. I would keep close to Mum and Dad and shiver with delight. When it was time for bed, our guests would unroll their blankets and go to sleep by the fire, and we would go off to our tent. The sun would wake us, peeping through the tent flaps with the sounds of the birds flying overhead. "Time to get up," Dad would say. The swagmen would have gone by the time we got up, always leaving a gift behind, like a tin of fruit or some eggs, that had been given to them by some kind housewife. It was hard to find work for a long time after the Depression, but the times were rich with people caring for each other. After breakfast, Mum and Dad packed up and left everything tidy, and we set off until we reached the shearing shed and the cottage, which we were to use for the next month or so. The boss was there to welcome us and to show us where we would be staying. Then we were taken to meet the shearers. They were all shapes and sizes, some old-timers with weather-beaten faces, and others new to the job from 16 onwards to learn the trade. They shook hands and greeted us warmly, but Mum was the one they were most interested in, as the cook was most important. If the shearers were happy and well fed, everything would run more smoothly. There were 20 shearers, 2 roustabouts and Dad. After an early night, Mum was up at 5 o'clock to face the large black stove, which had been lit by one of the young lads who did odd jobs in the kitchen for that day, before going to his job in the shed. A large iron urn stood on one side of the stove filled with water, heating up and ready for the large tin teapots, which made the hot strong tea. On the other side was a large iron pot of porridge. The 2 large frying pans were set on the top of the stove, and soon there was bacon frying in one and chops in the other. When this had cooked, they were kept warm in the oven, while the eggs were cooked and the toast was made. All the hot food was set on the 2 long tables, on which bottles of tomato sauce, tins of jam, large pots of tea, and jugs of milk were the only adornments. The shearers sauntered in for breakfast and collected their knives and forks from the drawers of the large kitchen dresser, which held pride of place. This was painted a dark green and had a large mirror and patterns of flowers and leaves ingrained in the wood. This lent an almost startling gaiety against the peeling paint of the walls. Work had to begin early, so there would not be much talk as the shearers ate their food. No wasted time. As they left to start work, each looked into the kitchen and said, "Well done, missus," and Mum sighed with relief, knowing she was accepted, so that was breakfast over with. Before clearing away, Mum, the young helper and I would have our breakfast and a well-earned rest for Mum. Then the washing up was done by the young lad. Then he would go off to his job in the shed. On doing some lessons on spelling and sums, which Dad had set out for me, I would be allowed to go off to play with the Aborigine children, who were the sons and daughters of Freddie the horsebreaker and his wife Violet. Whenever Dad had to drive into town, he would bring back some presents for me and the children. I would be allowed to choose the one I wanted and give the others to Violet's kids. I suppose Dad thought this would teach me to be kind to others, but I did not like doing this very much. But the laughter and delight of the children made me feel a bit better. And so the days slipped by, the shearers toiling in the oily heat of the shed, Mum cooking her roast dinners, corned beef, stews and dumplings, bread and butter custards, puddings, and sometimes as a treat a wine trifle of sponge cake, jelly and fruit in layers of wonderful colours. There would be scones, rock cakes and patty cakes on different days for morning and afternoon teas, which were taken to the shearing shed with billy cans of tea by the young off-sider. There would be the odd weekend off when the shearers would go into town, the younger ones to eye the girls and the older men to have a beer too many. Back they would come after their well-earned break and talk to Mum about their families and home. Others would nurse their hangovers. There would be the evenings after the meals, and the work was over when Mum would set her gramophone up in the dining room, and in the twilight there would ring out the voices of the great singers of the day. And as the sky turned pink and the shadows grew long, the music and the singing would drift across the paddocks to the soft lowing of the odd cow and the sheep settling for the night. There would be a screech of a cockatoo as it wheeled across the sky, and the many shiny eyes from the night creatures as they started hunting for their food. 9. A final comment. And so this is the end of these little simple stories of some of my life in the bush. The stories that are set down in these pages have been kept on the light side, but you, dear reader, may see between the lines, especially those of you who are of my vintage of 73, and who many have touched the edge of the depression that my dear mother and father lived through. The end. P.S. Then we moved to town, but that is another story.
Hello, I'm Joyce. I'm just thinking about the time when I was very much younger, in my teens, and we lived in the country, in a country town. And we didn't have a lot of visitors, very quiet place. And all of a sudden we'd think, the Rawleigh Man's coming. And this was the man who had a little suitcase with all the different sorts of things in it, like chicory coffee and all the cough medicines, syrup of figs, and all this. And my mother would prepare for the Rawleigh Man. She'd bake a cake, and he'd bring his case in and open it. We'd look at all these things and pick what we wanted. And then Mum would bring in the cake, and we'd have the teapot, nice cups of tea, and the Rawleigh Man would sit down and we'd all have a chat. It was like a little afternoon tea with a visitor, and it was a wonderful day.